All right, welcome everyone. Today we're going to be diving deeper into the world of React. And we're going to see what React does as far as providing us functionality to create some reactive sites, right? So far, we've been manipulating the DOM, utilizing JavaScript, but we're going to see that React actually gives us something to manipulate the DOM by creating two document object models for us. All right, we have our document object model that gets rendered by the browser. And then we have a document object model that is, we have the document object model that is originally rendered. And then we have a virtual document object model that is tracked by React and consistently running comparisons. We're going to be diving into that today. All right. Once we finish talking about these use state variables and use effect and how they work, we're going to go ahead and move into components. So if we were to make a list of items, how would we repeat those components happening over and over again? And how would we isolate each one of their set code? So let's dive into it. First, I have my empty directory here. How would I go about creating a V application inside of this directory?
Or the npm install v.
npm, in this case, we're going to use create V. And I want it inside of this directory. So do I want to run it with a period at the end or without a period?
With a period.
Perfect. So we're going to run it with a period there. It's going to create the V environment. You can say, hey, I want to utilize React and JavaScript. You can see the entire project was created, or the entire project structure. Now we're getting this done. Now run npm install and npm run dev. So what's the next step?
Make sure you're in your folder, and then npm install.
All right, let's run npm install. And it's going to go ahead and install everything from our project. All right, I see node modules was created. I see my package-lock JSON was created. Great. And finally, to get my development server running, what command do I need?
npm run dev.
Awesome. npm run dev. And that gets my development server running. And there we are. We have our React application being able to show with this counter and a couple of other little SVGs with links to V and React. Great. Well, let me clear this up. I'm going to go inside of my source directory, go to app CSS so I can get rid of all of the CSS because I don't want it. I'm going to go to index CSS, get rid of all of that as well. And then I'm going to go to app, and essentially I'm going to get rid of the entire body here. Get rid of the whole body. I'm just going to put H1. Like always, our classical hello Yankee. I'm going to get rid of this import statement along with all of the import statements up above. All right, so there it is. I have a blank HTML page that just says hello Yankee. Can someone explain to me how this function of app gets rendered by this application? How does this happen? Right, because as far as I'm tracking, the browser is expecting an index HTML file. So how does this JavaScript get inserted in there?
Through the HTML.
Oh, you're saying, okay, so we go to index HTML. All right, so index HTML, is that what's being rendered here on the screen?
No. Yes.
All right, let's hear it, Gary.
Can you go back to the previous page?
Absolutely.
It looks like we are. I just want to take a whack at it just to make sure I'm. So within the app.css, that shouldn't have anything to do with us importing the app function, right?
That's correct.
Is it because no, it's not because we're exporting. Help me out, Juan.
All right, let's pass it off to Juan.
I think it's the way it's rendered. in main.jxs and then import it into the index file using the source, right?
Nice. So in index, we have here a script that is pointing to main.jsx. So index is the file that's being rendered by the browser, but main.jsx is saying, hey, I want you to render all of the contents of app, which we can see that app is imported from app.jsx into the root directory or into the root division. So it grabs this return statement and this h1 element gets inserted inside of this root division. If we go into our inspector tools and take a look at the elements, we can see we have the body. Here's the division of root that we can see here on line 10. And even though it's empty here in line 10, when I open it up, I have h1 hello Yankee. And that is because we read the source. The source says, hey, I want you to insert app.jsx inside of that root. We go into app.jsx, and app.jsx is simply inserting an h1 element. Remember, these are called factor tags, or yes, fragment tags, I apologize. So they don't actually create a division, but they do give us the ability to create multiple elements without grouping them inside of a parent division. All right, and that's why we get a direct h1 element showing up inside of our browser. Okay, good. So now we have a understanding of how this information is being compiled and how it's being rendered by the browser, how we're transferring information. But now let's talk about making something dynamic, right? For this example, what we're going to do is we're just going to simply state, hey, I want to see a simple hello being able to populate, right? I want to have an h1 element that is able to say hello or say goodbye. So maybe we have a greeting here. Let's say this is, let's just make an h2 element and say that this is hello. And we give it an ID of greeting. Then I'm just gonna make a button. This button will say change greeting. And we're gonna give this an on-click function called change greeting. Now change greeting doesn't exist, so let's do create change greeting. What change greeting is going to do is it's going to grab that h1 element. So let's say let h1 be equal to document dot get element by ID, and we're going to grab it by greeting. All right, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to check if h1 dot value is equal to hello. Well, then I want h1 dot value, or I could just, oh, I probably should change that value. So I've been messing around with too many input tags and change that to inner text. And I can make it equal to goodbye. And then simply have an else statement saying else h1 dot inner text is equal to hello. And I need to change this hello to a capital H. All right, so there's my change greeting function. All right, my change greeting function, when it's activated on that click, it's going to capture the h1 element. I am then going to analyze the inner text. If the inner text is equal to hello, I'm going to change it to goodbye. If it's anything other than hello, I'm going to change it back to hello. And here we can see we have our h1 element. Here's the h2 tag. Oh, it's an h2. I named it h1. Let me change that. There you go, easy peasy. All right, so there's our h2 tag. We have our button that has an on click with change greeting. So as soon as I click this function, we're gonna see a trigger and it says goodbye. I click it again, it goes back to saying hello. All right, fantastic. Nothing crazy is happening here, right? We've seen this a couple of times before. But now we're going to change this functionality because since React knows that we're gonna want to create dynamic functions, it gives us a couple of different tools that we can utilize to essentially recreate this entire function in a more effective or sophisticated manner. So with that said, before I move on to updating and bringing in React hooks, it is extremely important that we do understand this, because if I dive deeper into React hooks without understanding how this works, we're not really going to get much out of the lecture. So does anyone have any questions regarding how this entire process of manipulating the DOM with JavaScript works? All right, I don't see anything in Yankee questions. And it seems like there's no questions here in the classroom. So let's go ahead and dive into some React hooks. Starting off with useState. Gonna go ahead and import useState, and you'll see that useState comes from React. Now, we're gonna go more into imports and exports later on and explain why this comes into curly brackets. For now, just know that when you import, it's going to come within a curly brackets. But we're going to be covering this here shortly in the second portion of our lecture. Now, this tool here from React does two things. It is going to create a variable that will hold on to something that's being initialized. So let's write it out. Let's say const, and we'll just call this greeting. And then we'll create a variable or a second variable named set greeting. We utilize the useState function and set it to hello. Now, what does this do? All right. This useState function is going to return an array. And inside of that array, it's going to return the init variable or the variable state. And it's going to return a function to update the variable. Right, so this is returning an array. And all we're doing on this left-hand side is we're doing variable reassignment, or excuse me, we're doing array, we're essentially deconstructing the array and setting it to variable, comma, function. So we have a variable on the left-hand side, and we have a function. Great. Well, now how do I make this hello show up inside of my h2 tag? Well, currently I just wrote hello straight in there, but because this is going to be dynamic and have some functionality in there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually insert the name of the variable greeting, right? And now you can see that hello shows up in the h2 tag. Now this is no longer happening because I had something typed out saying hello. It is, and actually let's just do it this way. Let's do I'm sure there's no confusion. So this is where we typed it out and gave it an ID. If I click on this button, you'll see that nothing happens anymore because now the document.getElement by ID of greeting no longer exists. So this function is now broken. Great. And now I can go into my change greeting function, right? Well, let's keep it nice and simple first. Before we go into doing this whole change greeting, let's just say that on click, what I want to do is I want to set my greeting to goodbye. All right, so I'm gonna refresh the page. There's no errors. I click, and you can see that it instantly updated the greeting variable to goodbye. All right. So greeting is initialized on line 6 with the initial value of hello. Hello gets returned as the variable of greeting. And the use state also returns a function to update this variable with set greeting. So I can make another button here. And let's just say hello and goodbye. And all that's happening is when we click on this buttons, we're simply just changing the value of that variable. We are setting the variable of greeting to the new parameter that we're passing into that function. And that's how this use state hook works. All right, we're going to go deeper into how this is actually happening on the browser and how React is comparing the virtual DOM and the DOM to be able to have these dynamic effects. But before I dive into that, does anyone have any questions over how use state is created, what it does, and how you can access those variables, both the variable itself that you initialized and the function for setting a value for that variable? Let's hear it, Juan.
So the function for set greeting essentially takes over how use state is used up there to initialize. Same syntax and returning a function and all.
Right. So this will return the function. The function is set greeting. So every time we set the greeting, it updates the variable. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, so it basically mimics the use state over there on the right of it on line 6.
Oh, I see. Yes, it's essentially mimicking. Just remember use state. What it does is it initializes both of these and returns these, right? Whereas set greeting is just specifically updating the value of that one. So I see what you mean in syntactual manner. It looks like it's mimicking, but the behaviors are different. Does that answer?
Gotcha.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Of course. Sam?
Could you zoom out on hair? Because I want to see like both the top and the bottom, so I just kind of have a good understanding of what's going on. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Do you want me to just bring this down, maybe?
Yeah, that would help out. And then use state is used to pretty much can you just go over what use state is one more time? Because I was just kind of it was bouncing around a lot, so I just want to make sure I understand it well.
Absolutely. So use state is a function or a React hook that returns a variable and a function. A variable that we can reference to be able to set this parameter inside of our HTML context. And you can see that I inserted the variable inside of the HTML with curly brackets. And then it returns a function that we can utilize to update said variable. The reason why that's important is because now instead of writing all of this JavaScript code that I needed to be able to change my goodbye, I could just simply do it in one specific line of set greeting. Did that address your question, Sam?
And then why did you put the hello in the use state? What does that change?
So this hello is the initial value, right? So use state requires init value. So the initial value of greeting is hello, because that's what I pass into the use state. All right, and then this is just a function. So use state returns a variable and a function to update. The variable gets set to the initialized value, and then the function of set greeting is utilized to update that value to goodbye or hello. All right, so if I refresh the page, you can see it already renders hello. That's not because of this on-click here on line 27. That's because the initial value of that use state is hello. All right.
Thank you.
Of course. James?
Is there, maybe this is coming later, is there a way to, like you had the original way without the use state, to like change hello goodbye with just one button and having them flip instead of having to use two different buttons like that?
Yeah, there absolutely is. We could do a itinerary statement, and that would work as well. So maybe, let me demonstrate that here, just so that we can see its implementation. Right? We could have set greeting, and then we could say, "Hey, is greeting equal to hello?" And then make that a question mark and say if it is. So if that is true, then we want to set to goodbye. And if it's not true, then we want to set to hello. Right? So now when I click it, it goes goodbye, hello.
You
So
have to do it in line like that. That's just one of many ways to do it, I assume.
Yeah, that's just one of many ways. You could do
Cool.
the entire thing here, and just instead of saying H2 element, you could just reference greeting and say if greeting is equal to hello, then set greeting to goodbye, else set greeting to hello.
Cool. Thank you.
Of course. Any other questions? All right, it doesn't seem like there are any other questions. So let's go ahead and talk about how this is actually happening. All right, what is going on within the browser and React to be able to demonstrate this? So unfortunately, I wasn't able to redraw all of this out, but I am going to add some arrows here so that we can see what's happening. Here we have our hello code platoon, right? And this hello code platoon is the object that we're going to be changing. Maybe instead of hello, we wanted to eventually say goodbye code platoon. So we would have a use state variable here. And what this use state variable would do is it would say, hey, I have something const. Here is a greeting, set greeting. And I want to make this equal to a use state that says hello. All right, so now I got my function and I have my variable. All right, so in JavaScript code, this hello is partly just wrapped in brackets with greeting inside of it, and then it says code platoon. All right, and I want to run some sort of comparison so that I know how to update this information. So the virtual DOM is being tracked by React. The DOM is what's just inside of the browser, right? And they're consistently, every time I change the state, and this is important to remember, use state will also trigger this comparison between the DOM and the virtual DOM, right? So that's another reason why we need to ensure that we're utilizing hooks, because if you don't utilize hooks and you're using just plain old vanilla JavaScript, you're not going to get this comparison between the DOM and the virtual DOM every time. This comparison only happens when you're utilizing the React hooks, right? There's something in there that says, hey, trigger this comparison and look at each other. All right. And then we have our button, right? We have our button to be able to update this information. Well, when I click on said button, what happens is this hello gets changed inside of the virtual DOM and it turns into goodbye. Make that a little bigger there. And then once the function is done, once it's completed, once set greeting is done updating the variable inside of the virtual DOM, then React looks at the DOM. And let me just do it this way. Let's say, wonder if we have an eyeball icon here. Oh, we do not. Can I make an eyeball? Let's try it. I cannot make an eyeball. Why not? Close enough, right? No, no takers. Oh. No,
That ain't it.
because now it looks like a button or a switch.
That ain't it.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Well, React essentially looks at both of these. Oh, there you are. Looks at both the DOM and the virtual DOM, and it says, all right, well, what's the difference between these? And it's not letting me do my arrow, so I'm gonna have to pencil draw it. All right, so it takes a look at the virtual DOM, and it runs a comparison. It says, hey, are these the same? And in this case, they are not the same. Right? And because they are not the same, what it's going to do is it's going to send a message to the browser saying, hey, here is the new HTML content that I want you to render. So this new HTML content gets sent via the browser. And then the browser crosses out hello, and we get our good old goodbye showing up on the browser. All right, so I click on the button. The first thing that gets updated is the virtual DOM. We get goodbye. Once the virtual DOM is done updating, React takes a look at the virtual DOM and the DOM and says, hey, are these the same? They are not. Because they are not the same, it's going to make the DOM, what is rendering on the browser, look exactly the same as the virtual DOM. It's essentially force feeding the browser saying, hey, this is what you're going to render now. And it gives it the information. And then the browser updates to show the user the correct updated info. All right, so that's what's going on with useState. Does anyone have any questions regarding how the DOM and the virtual DOM communicate with one another? Okay, no questions at all. In that case, let's go into mapping through some data here. We're going to go ahead and go into our project, and we're going to extend our project to show us some list items, right? So let's go into our project here. I'm going to make a new file. I'm just going to name these tasks.json. And these are all from our GitHub or from our curriculum here. So let me go ahead and send out the link in case anyone is following along and wants to copy this file. These are all just tasks. They're JSON tasks. You can see that they just have a title and whether they are completed or not. And they are being rendered on the screen, right? Or the goal is to render all of these tasks on the screen. Well, this looks pretty familiar to us, or it should look pretty familiar to us, this format of JSON. If you remember when we were working in Flask and we were sending requests to our Flask server, our Flask server was sending a response back in JSON. And this is how a server communicates to a front end, right? Our backend and front end communication is going to work. Our backend, or excuse me, our front end is sending a request, it receives data, and after it receives data, we're gonna render it for the user. Well, let's go into how that works. So currently we have our use state here. We're going to create a new use state for tasks, and we're going to import all of these tasks from JSON. So I'm going to come up above here. And I'm actually going to bring this down just so that it's all nicely compacted together. All right, and let's import our tasks here. All right, so all we're doing is we're going to say, hey, I want to import tasks from tasks.json. And now I want to create a use state that will have all of these JSON tasks as its initial value. So if we're looking at the example above, how would I do that? How would I create a use state variable for task, and let's just call these JSON tasks. And I want to create a use state that will return a variable and a function for being able to update these tasks. How does that work? How could I do that?
Ask the question again. I was typing.
Of course, yeah, I want to create a use state for JSON that will be initialized with the value of JSON tasks, and I will have a variable and a function to update these tasks. Let's hear it, Jacob. I was about to call you Jason.
Oh, no, it's okay. I'm just gonna take a stab at it, but could we identify it by the ID numbers in test.json and then like have it actually return like the description of the task?
Yeah, I think later on, once we get into the functionality of how we're going to be managing the tasks, that would be a great idea. But first, I need a way to actually render these tasks, right? Because right now, I just have a JSON file data that's being here. How do I insert it into JavaScript and create a use state for tasks with set greeting?
So you would. Oh,
Great
go
hook.
ahead.
I was gonna say hook, but you can go ahead.
So would you just do the same thing, const, and then um, what are we going to define it as task? We'll set a variable called task, and then set task as the function, and then set that equal to use state, and then I don't know what we would initialize the variable. Oh, JSON task. Appreciate that.
Of course, yeah.
Perfect.
That's fantastic. So now we're gonna import everything. Everything's being imported. We're setting it inside of our task here, and we could even log it to the console so we can take a look. Let's see what task's initial value is. We go over to Vite. Let me refresh it so that we don't see any of those elements. And if I come over here, we can see that task's initial value is an array of objects. Nice. So now, for all of these objects, or for each one of these objects inside of these arrays, I want to iterate through this array, and I want to create an unordered list where each object is represented by a list item. How could I do that? Let me pseudocode it so we all have it. So we want an unordered list. We want to iterate through tasks. And for each task object, render a list item.
So could we do all this in the return statement, kind of like what you did with Hello Yankee and stuff? Or do you want to separate it?
Yeah, we could definitely do it all within the return statement, right? Because we can write JavaScript within the return statement by just putting it inside of curly brackets. So we have our return statement there. I'm actually gonna create my unordered list.
Order list? Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
Okay. So there you go. We have the unordered list part done. How do I iterate through tasks? And at this point, I'm not really looking for a for loop. I want a different way of iterating through an array in JavaScript.
We use the map function.
Perfect. Yeah, we can utilize the map function, right? We can say, hey, I want to tasks.map. And what I want to do is map takes in a parameter, which is just something that it's going to utilize to reference. In this case, all I want to do is return an li, and I'm going to say, hey, this is a tasks. All right, so there's hello Yankee. We're iterating through that array of tasks. We're iterating through this array of 7. And for every object, we are creating a list item. All right, awesome. Does anyone have any questions over how this works? Something that I want to make sure that I point out is these open parentheses here. If you do a curly bracket, you need to ensure that you include a nested return statement. These open parentheses are saying, hey, inside of these parentheses, I just want you to automatically return. Don't run any logic, just return this information, right? So this is just shorthand for saying the following. Right, so this still works. Notice that now I'm utilizing curly brackets, but I'm just having to explicitly write a return statement. Preferably utilize those open parentheses. All right, doesn't seem like there are any questions. So let's dive into maybe listing these items, right? I want to make sure that I know whether a task is present and if it's completed. Okay, well, if I want to know if there is a task, I could simply just pass in, hey, this is the task dot task, because that's what it is in the object. And now we can see we're getting the actual names from these tasks, right? We have build a simple to-do list. There it is. Add the ability. We're accessing the item or the object, and then we are accessing the key. All right, so we import the tasks. We set them to a useState function of tasks and set tasks. We then iterate through set task list. And for every object inside of that list, we are then rendering a list item. And we're rendering the title or the .task key value. Does anyone have any questions over this? Let's hear it, Sam.
So when it says task, so the first task is just generating a list, and then the second one's actually pulling from the JSON file. So
Question.
is that what's happening?
Yeah, so this could be a little bit confusing. This is what's returning the JSON file, right? So this returns the JSON file, which is a list of objects. We then iterate through them, and we could just call these, let's say this list object instead. This is just a variable, right? And we can then enter the list object, which is just one of these, and we are accessing the .task attribute inside of the object. Did that answer your question, Sam?
Yes, but then how does that all know when to stop the list? Will it just iterate it through until there's no more so I'm seeing on the right here it's like 0 to 6. We'll just iterate through until there's no more items anymore in that JSON file?
That's correct. It's
For
going
specifically for task?
yes, it's going to iterate
Okay.
until it's completed with that list. All right. And then finally, let's just show if it's completed or not, right? Let's add an input type, and I think this is radio, and there's a checked attribute here, and we can make the checked attribute be equal to completed. And there you go. All right, we can see which one of these tasks have been completed. So it looks like only 2 of them have been. All right, so we have implement task deletion functionality. That's been completed. And we have build a simple to do using Node.js. That has also been completed. And the rest of them aren't checked. All right, so all I did was, again, I utilized an input of type radio. And I'm just referencing that JSON file to set that checked attribute, if it has been completed or not. All right. Does anyone have any questions over this?
Yeah, can you go into is the list So list object. Oh, I see. Never mind. I answered my own question.
Okay, awesome.
So that on line 30, where it says checked equals list object dot completed, because it's true in the document, that's pretty much a variable holder, correct?
Right, so list object is a variable holder and it's just calling the completed attribute, right? So if it is completed, it shows it as a checked radio input. And if it's false, then it doesn't check it. All right, Juan.
You're showing whether or not they're completed. Can we manipulate JSON files? For example, like if they have it as completed equaling true, can we change it to false and then back to true if we want to?
Are you saying from the user interface to JSON file? Or are you saying for me to just go into the JSON file and change it?
No, from the user interface to the JSON file. So if I clicked one of those little radio buttons and change it to false, is there any way that it would then affect the JSON file, or is that something that just happens locally and then gets more complicated as you go, I guess?
Yeah, that's definitely something that happens locally and gets more complicated. We're going to see all of our updates are going to be in reference to this variable moving forward. The JSON file is never going to change. But what would happen in the full stack scenario is when somebody clicks on this button, a function would send a signal to the server saying, hey, this is now completed. The backend server would then mark it as completed inside of the database, and then it would update the information inside of the database. Does that answer your question, Juan?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. All right. Doesn't seem like there are any other questions. So let's go ahead and push forward here. And let's talk about the use effect function. And the use effect function is the last thing that we're going to cover before diving deeper into this list item and showing some component functionality. So I'm going to comment this out for the time being. And we're just going to utilize this greeting statement here to show use effect. And I want to essentially have a function here that's going to say, hey, I want to make a, oh, look at that. We'll just change this. I want to create a button and we'll just put update here. And what we'll do is we'll say, hey, when this button is clicked, I want you to console.log this information. So let's go ahead and do, okay. Let's call it handle click. What this will do is say if greeting is equal to hello, then I want to set greeting to goodbye. And then I'm going to go ahead and console.log greeting. And then do the whole else, and then set greeting to hello, and console.log greeting. All right, now let's call this function. Let's say on click, I want to handle click. All right, let me clear that up. Let me refresh the page. Okay, we have no console log statements right now. I click on update, and now I see hello. Nice. And actually, I might have made a mistake here. Let me do this and this and that. All right, there you go. All right. Whoa, wait a second. So notice this behavior here. I'm getting hello in app.jsx on line 26. Right, so line 26 is showing me, hey, this is hello. But I utilized a function to change that value to goodbye. And it is working. It's changing the value to goodbye, but this is still saying hello when I log it into the console. Well, that's not necessarily what I want, right? I'm getting some sort of misbehavior here. When I click update again, well, now we know the current value is hello, but my console is showing me that the current value is goodbye. So what does this tell us?
Is it telling you what's gonna populate when you click the button update?
Yeah, awesome. So it's actually telling me what the previous value was when I click the button update, rather than telling me what the current value is. It's telling me the previous value. Well, that's some really weird behavior, and definitely not something that I want, especially when I'm working with, multiple files and multiple data. Maybe there's a better way to identify what the current value is. Well, that's where the use effect hook comes into play. And we can import use effect up above by typing in use effect. Now, use effect can be a little confusing when it comes to syntax, because it's essentially a function that takes in a function as its first parameter, and its second parameter is a dependency array. So let's go into that. So use effect takes in two params, one, which is a function, and two, which is a dependency array. All right. Well, in this case, the functionality that I want is I just want to see what the current value of greeting is. I don't want to see its previous value. I want to see its current value. And you can see it's already being triggered, right? Use effect is showing up already, and it's showing me that, hey, this console.log statement is currently greeting. Okay. But when I click update and it changes back and forth, it's not giving me any more log statements. It's not logging anything into my console. So that's where this dependency array comes into play. Right? The behavior that I want, or the function that I want to trigger, is a console log statement, where I'm logging the current value of greeting to my console. But my second argument, which is my dependency array, needs to know, hey, when do you want this function to be triggered? Right? It's always going to be triggered on the initial render, or we call that mounting. Right? So it's always going to be triggered on the initial rendering of an application. But when else do you want me to function or work? Well, I can tell it, I also want you to work or trigger this behavior every time the value of greeting is changed. Now, remember, these are hooks, right? So they have special functionality. Because this is a use state hook, it triggers the virtual DOM and the DOM comparison, but it also talks to use effect, right? And now use effect says, oh, you want me to keep an eye on greeting? Great. Every time greeting, the state of greeting changes, I'll give you a log into your console of what that new value is. So we refresh the page, we can see hello is being rendered. When I click on update, it turns into goodbye. And now it's matching. All right, it's like, hey, goodbye is happening, goodbye is there. Now we have hello Yankee, and now we see hello. So essentially all this is doing is it's keeping an eye on a specific variable, or excuse me, a specific state variable. I want to make that clear. It has to come from a use state. And every time the value of that state variable changes, it will trigger the behavior within the function body.
Can you repeat that last statement that you just made?
Of course. So greeting or use effect will keep an eye on a state variable. And every time that state variable is updated, it's going to trigger the function within the function body in the first parameter, right? So that's why it needs two parameters. One being the function, and two, the dependency array. What is it that you want me to look at that will trigger this function inside of the body?
My next question is, are you going to get into some examples of what this use effect would be? Well, I guess a use case for it. What
Absolutely.
is it?
Yeah, we'll be diving into that right now here shortly. All right. Okay, it doesn't seem like there are any other questions. So let's go into putting some functionality inside of this use effect function, right? And let's start bringing in all of the previous knowledge that we have and go back into our, I think we've messed around with the Pokey API enough. Maybe we take a look at the Rick and Morty API today and communicate with the Rick and Morty API so that we can look at some characters here. So here we have get a single character. I have no idea who character 1, 2, or 3 is. But let's go into creating this application, right? I want to have a character selector. So let's say this is an H1 and this is select a character. And what this character selector is going to do is it's going to render an image. We're going to have an image with the source, and this source is just going to be equal to a character image. We'll just spell it this way. All right, and then we're going to have multiple buttons. I wonder if this allows for the HTML shortcuts. It does. Nice. All right, and for all of these buttons, we're going to have the onClick function of set character ID to a specific number. All right. 1. Oh, that messed it up. Okay. Let's have 2 and 3. Now, this is all just experimental, right? We have our buttons here. We have our set character ID. So let's start creating these use states. So we have our const of character image. Then we have our set character image. We're going to make that equal to a use state function. And I'm just going to grab the original Rick here.
I think you meant set character ID.
Oh, yes, I also want to set that next. Yes, correct. So we'll have const character ID and then set character ID. I can make that equal to 1. Just to have that as the initial value. I forgot to add the use state. There you go. All right, and now we have the set character image, which I can't find image for some reason. Oh, there you are. All right. There you go. So now we have some working code here. We have our image. We have some setting selectors here or some character selections here. And if we go to our application, it should just show us an image with 3 buttons. Great. So everything's working pretty well here. Now let's go ahead and add some functionality, right? Why did we learn all of this stuff up to this point? Like, how is this going to create a dynamic site? Well, essentially what I want to do is I want to have the user or give the user the ability to click on each one of these buttons and get a new image to show up. So I'm just going to create that function. So get character image. This is going to be an asynchronous function so that I can utilize async and await. I'm going to go ahead and install Axios since we know that's going to be making all of our requests. right? So now I have Axios also available. Let me import that. There we see that Axios has been imported. Great. So now in this get character image, I want to say, all right, well, let response, actually, I'm just going to grab data, be equal to await Axios.get. And I'm going to actually include the char. Oh, I don't need to do it this way, actually. I'm going to then send to the Rick and Morty API character avatar 1 JPEG. No, that doesn't make sense. Let me look at the documentation here for getting a character. So here's my request for getting a character. That's what I need. Okay, so I'm going to send it to this URL, but I'm going to update the character ID. All right. So since the information, it's going to grab the request, or it's going to grab the response, and then we're going to grab the data out of said response by using that curly brackets data. And then inside of data, when that comes back, all we need is the image key. So we're going to then set character image to data dot image. All right, so there's our function. We've created our function that's going to be able to update our picture every single time, right? Because once it sets the image, this is going to get updated on the DOM and show me a character. Well, now for the final portion, I'm going to create a use effect that is going to take in a function, and it's going to have a dependency list on the character ID. So every time the character ID is updated, this function will get triggered. And the function will grab image, and I have to do it this way. And I could either utilize async and await. I think I have to utilize async actually. Yeah, so let's do const get image. This is going to be an asynchronous function. And all it's going to do, it's going to await or get character image. Then we're going to call that get image function. Now, notice how I'm nesting it, right? I am putting it within another async function. And the reason behind that is because useEffect requires me that if I have any asynchronous functionality, it exists in here as well. So I could probably just make my life simple and put this function in here. Later on, we'll go into how to isolate this behavior and file structure and all of that. Just know this is more than likely the usual syntax that you'll see for asynchronous functions. Well, now let's take a look at our application. Let me refresh it to make sure there are no errors. Okay, I click on the number 2, and now we can see that the character Morty is populating. Number 3 gives me summer, and I could switch vice versa between all of them. All that's happening is every time I click on one of these buttons, the character ID changes. Once the character ID changes, this use effect is triggered, and it runs the function, which runs get character image. Get character image runs an Axios request to grab an image from a specific API. It then sets that as the character image, which updates the DOM for the image source. All right, so that's just putting it all together, everything that we've learned up to this point, speaking to APIs, utilizing Axios. Where does the use effect come into play? How does async and await work? That's everything that we've learned up to this point inside of React. Does anyone have any questions over the demonstration that we just saw? All right, let's hear it, Jacob.
I might have missed it. Where did you declare or initialize character and image at?
Yeah, character image is a use state right up here.
Oh no, I'm at when like right below the, oh, you got data dot image. Okay, I see. I missed that part. So data dot image. Okay, I see what you did.
All right, Juan.
I think mine's a little bit easy for line 41 for let data. What is that syntax doing? I don't think I've seen that before.
Yeah, so we're just doing object restructuring here. This returns the response. The response is an object, right? But because I don't need to, before we were doing let response is equal to await, and then we could do let data is equal to response.data. If I'm essentially skipping the response.data step, and I'm just grabbing the data straight out of the response. Does that answer your question, Juan?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, awesome. Jacob, do you still have a question, or is your hand just up? All right, Tristan.
For the use effect you made on line 45, you said that you could just implement that method you made on line 40 into it, so you don't even need to have that method created on the outside of the use effect.
So you're saying line 40, if I could just implement it in here, that way it's not on the outside of the use effect. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, so you're not having like two of the same methods.
Yes, so that's a great question. And this goes into more of isolating code. Later on, we're going to learn that you typically want anything that's sending requests or interacting with specific APIs in separate files. So this would go inside of something of maybe called Rick and Morty utilities.jsx, right? And what I would do is I would import this function and then call it inside of this use effect, because I may have to utilize this function in separate files. And I want all of the code that interacts with a third-party API in one specific spot, so that if one thing changes, it changes for all the other functions. Does that answer?
Okay. Yes, it does. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. Any other questions?
Can you scroll over for line 41 just so I can see the end of that line? Okay. Yeah, for some reason. Okay. Yeah, I'm getting weird over that, but I'll fix it.
Yeah, if we are trying to follow along, let me go ahead and send this in Yankee questions, just so everybody has a copy of the entire file. All right. Any other questions? Okay, great. If there are no other questions, let me go ahead and pause the recording here. All right, welcome back, everyone. So right before we left for a break, we were able to start this image here, where we can grab specific images of one character. We were able to utilize all of our use state functions and use effect, and we saw kind of the whole enchilada coming together, right? I'm noticing there's quite a bit of code here that we are not necessarily utilizing. So I'm going to move some of this stuff around to try to clean up our page here. Let's see. Let's move that. We are going to need that. We don't necessarily need this anymore. So I'm going to comment. Oh, hello. Going to comment that out. And we definitely don't need that. So let me go ahead and grab all of this and throw it somewhere else. Gonna throw it up above so that it's not in our way. And I think there's a little bit of more cleanup that we want to do. We're not going to be utilizing any of this. So I'm going to comment all that out. Turn this back into our to-do list here. And let me okay, awesome. So we've commented everything that we're not going to need out or move some things around. Here we still have our function and the way it works. We're not gonna leave this portion either, so I'm gonna move that down. And let me bring back up our to-do list exercise here so that it's all easily visible inside of one area. All right, so just to refresh as to where these tasks come from, we have a task.json that's just a list of objects that's supposed to simulate a response from an API. We're then importing these tasks as a JSON data. We're setting it as the initial value of the variable tasks with a useState function of set tasks. And we are then iterating through set tasks to create this list object. Nice. Now, let's dive a little bit deeper into these list objects and how they work. All right. Let's say I wanted to create some sort of itinerary statement where I wanted these list objects to all have one specific value, right? For example, this completed tasks. Maybe I wanted to be able to update this information. Instead of making this radio, let's make it type checkbox. All right, so now you can see that if I make it type checkbox, you know, they still have a default value and it's not really giving the user the ability to click on them. So let's fix that. All right, let's make another use state that will bring us the ability to click. So const is completed and then set is completed. All right, this is going to be a use state function. And we're going to set this just to false for now. We know that it's always going to be set to some sort of variable. So now we're going to change this value and we're going to change it to is completed. And then we're also going to put an on change. Yeah, I think it's on change. Let's go with on change. We're going to put an on change function here that will capture the event and will set is completed to e.target.checked. All right, so let's do a little bit of cleanup and formatting. So now we have a checking capability. Every time somebody checks the checkbox, it's going to change it to whether the checkbox has actually been checked or not. So let's see what happens. Oh, all right. So we're able to click on it and all of them either turn into checked or not checked. Interesting. Can anyone think of the reason why all of them are changing and not just an independent one?
None of them has a unique ID.
Okay, so none of them has a unique ID. Let's change that here. Let's make it an ID and let's pass that the list object dot ID. Okay, so we set them all to a unique ID, and now when we click it, it's still having the same behavior. Can anyone think of another possible reason why this is happening?
Could it possibly be from it being mapped or it not having the right key value?
Okay, so we changed it to key, but key also didn't do it. But you did mention something having to do with map. Let's see, Juan.
I think I just did this. It was with the I think you got to pass a list object as well as the key itself to then set it.
Nice. Yeah, so we have the key and we have our list object, right? Well, there's a little bit of complexity that goes into iterating through objects. And we have this nice drawing in our selector tool, but essentially, or excuse me, in our curriculum. But essentially what is happening is we have all of these list items, right? Oh, and let me put that in the middle. And I also just realized this is, oh, well. Looks like I've zoomed out quite a bit. I apologize, everyone. There you go. So we have all of these list items or all of these li elements, and every single one of our li elements have a checked component, right? Or a is checked kind of attribute that belongs to this target. Okay, nothing too complicated so far. But currently, if we take a look at where we're creating our variable of is completed, which is essentially holding the value of whether this is being checked, that's not independent to each one of these list items, is it? It's just one variable saying, hey, is checked. And currently is checked is in a parent level, meaning that it applies to every single one of these list items, right? It's being implemented all at once to every single one of our list items without any isolation, right? Where in reality, the solution to this problem would be that instead of having it at the parent level, what we would have is something along these lines, where we have our checked component, but inside of each one of these checked components, we also have a, hey, is this checked? Living as a child inside each one of them. Oh, jeepers. There it is. All right. So currently we have this structure where all of our list items are being created, but this is checked is living outside of the list item. It's living as a parent. All right. Where in reality, we want it to be nested within the list item object. Well, how do we make this happen? This is where components come into play. Now, components are essentially just, hey, I want to insert this lines of code in here, right? It's a screenshot of a line of code, and we're just inserting it into the master of our code over here. So let's go ahead and create that. I'm going to go into my source directory, and inside of my source directory, I'm going to make a directory named components. Then I'm going to change directory into components, and I'm going to make a file named list item.jsx. And notice how I'm naming it with the convention of a capital L at the beginning. You don't have to. I strongly recommend it when it comes to components in React. All right, so there's my list item.jsx. Well, now for this list item, I'm just gonna say, hey, const list item is going to return JSX elements such as an li and say, I am a list item. And then we're going to go into how this is being exported. All right. Now, there's a couple of different ways to export information. If I have multiple functions inside one file that I want to export, I can just place the export keyword on the left-hand side of the function, and that will allow me to import it. If I go into app.jsx now, and I say, hey, I want to import list item, you'll see that it's able to recognize it. But notice how I put these curly brackets at the very end. Well, that's because there's many functions from this list item.jsx. So because there is many functions, and it's assuming there is many functions because I am only utilizing an export statement, it is saying, hey, I only want the functions within these curly brackets out of the list item. It's kind of like object destructuring, right? Essentially what JavaScript does is it interprets the entire file as an object with key value pairs. And all we're doing is grabbing the key of list item, this one function. All right. Well, there's one way of doing it. But with components and pages, the more typical thing to do is that only one function is being exported. So with only one function being exported, we're going to ask for an export default statement at the very bottom of our page saying, hey, the default thing, the only thing that's being exported out of this file will be list item. So now if I want to import list item, it still recognizes it, but notice since it knows this is the only thing that's being exported, because I utilized that default keyword, it no longer wraps it between those curly brackets. All right, so now I have list item being imported. But how do I implement it? Well, instead of having this entire list object here, I can comment this out and just put in list item and utilize a self-closing tag, just like that. Well, let's see what this does now. Well, now if I go into my V development server, it says, hey, I am a list item for every single one of these. So essentially what it's doing, it's rendering app.jsx, mapping through the list of objects. And for every one of those objects, it's rendering this component of list item, which is just an li that says I am a list item. And I see a question. So let's open it up for questions. Go ahead, Owen.
Yeah, can you go back to the import and export statements? So what would be the purpose of doing either one, whether you have it in the curly brackets or not? Is it just for looks, or is there some rhyme or reason why you'd want it either in the curly brackets or not? Or would you always want it the way you have it now?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when it comes to components, they should always have a export default statement. They should not just be export const like we saw earlier. But as we spoke, or in the example that I demonstrated of this get characters, this is going to be something that interacts with APIs, and it have multiple functions that interact with an API. I want them all within one file, meaning that when I export all of these, there should not be a default function that gets exported. So this should always be imported within curly brackets. If multiple functions from a file are capable of being imported, it should be wrapped inside of curly brackets. If you have a default statement, it should not be wrapped within curly brackets. Does that answer your question, Owen?
So essentially, say you had more than one function in your list item.jsx, you'd want to wrap it in curly brackets and not have an export default statement at the end, or
so if I have multiple functions inside of my list item, they could live within the list item function, but if you have a default keyword being accessed here, only this function will ever be exported, or anything nested within it.
So how would you make it? Like if say you had another function in there, would you just do export list item and then comma the other function name?
No. So if I had another function here, so if I have something like const say hello, and all it did was return hello, this function would never be able to be exported or accessed anywhere outside of the list item. So this will always be only accessible to the list item function.
So you would only ever put one function inside of a component file?
A component file will always have one functions. Yes. Okay. One master function, right? If we have something like utilities or like an API, where I'm saying, hey, let me comment this out and let me answer this real quick. So let's say I have something like const get authenticated, right? And this is an API function. And I don't think I need pass in here or anything like that. And let's say I have a different function saying, hey, once we are authenticated, then get client info. And once we have our get client info, we have a const, I don't know, maybe post client status, right? Let's say it's a social media website. And we have a series of functions that all work within Axios or an API, then all of these would be an export statement, right? Which makes all of these being able to be imported here. So now if I come here to my file, I can import get authenticated or get auth, right? From components list item. Notice how that brings the curly brackets. That's because I have 3 separate functions with export, but no export default, right? And if I try to bring back my export default, it's going to throw an error. Let me try to refresh this. So here we have an error. It's saying, hey, each child list component. Oh, that is not the error I was expecting to see. Maybe they updated React lately. But this will usually not fly. It will crash with all of your other export statements, right? So
Gotcha.
components will only have the one component that's being exported. You can have a ridiculous amount of nested functions inside of this one component, but the only thing that's being exported is the component function of list item. All right, awesome. Any other questions?
Can you go back to the app JSX just so I can see again where you inserted the import?
Yes, the import is right here.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Of course. Yeah, and imports will usually go always at the top of the page. It's just that we have a tremendous amount of code from examples all in this page, and I think all of it's valuable, so I don't want to erase any of it. And that's the only reason why I'm keeping the import statements here. But they will always be at the top of the page. All right. So now we have our list item. Everything is rendering, and we're able to see our list item here. Now, if we go back to our drawing, we have this is checked at the parent level, right? And we said, hey, we actually want it at the child level. We want it to be nested within each LI component. So all I need to do is take out this is completed and bring it in here. And import our good old use state as well. All right, so there's use state being imported. We have our is completed. And now let's grab our check function. All right, so now we have our input with is completed and being able to mark with event.target.isChecked. Now let's see what happens when we click on this item. Well, now when I click on the item, because it's on the child level, it only affects the one list item. All right, so before we had this, hey, I'm at the parent level, so I'm going to affect all of you. But now we have now I am nested within each individual list item because now we're our own component and my code is isolated. So I will only affect one list item at a time. Does anyone have any questions over this? Let's hear it, one.
Or can I go back to the other list item real quick?
Yeah.
Got it. Thank you.
Of course. And then, oh, and I see you fighting back the urge to ask a question, I think. So if you have a question, just ask.
Yeah, I'm just trying to frame how I want to ask it. Can you just from the moment you load that page, like go through what's happening, especially with like the list item, what's it called, component? Because Like
Okay.
it just show that because, or could you just expand actually the app.jsx and list item.jsx and just see like where the imports are from, like where everything falls in your files? I think that's where I'm confused.
Okay, absolutely. Yeah. So let me see Juan's question before I do a deep dive into yours real quick. Go ahead, Juan.
Sorry, real quick. The app.jsx, we're putting the list items and all this stuff in there, and then when we go to main JSX, that one just has app. Should we be putting everything within app.jsx and then using that as the final for main.jsx?
Yeah, so main.jsx will always be utilized strictly for inserting app or insertion of the JavaScript code into HTML. So that's the only purpose for main.jsx. We don't want to give it a different purpose, right? Now, app.jsx will be used to gather all the different components and information. So app.jsx is where we put all of our components, where we put all of our pages. Main.jsx is for inserting all of the app into the HTML. All right.
Got it. Thank you.
Of course. All right. And now let's do a walkthrough to this, right? So currently we're not utilizing Axios. Let me comment that out so that it's not in our way. We have a list of tasks here, which is just task.json. It's just a list, an array of objects, right? In app.jsx, we also have this list item. So we're importing the list item function from the file list item. It is an export default. And all this does is return an li element. All right. Now in app.jsx, we are grabbing or we are creating a useState variable and function, the variable named tasks, which its initial value is the array of objects from tasks.json. And then we have a set tasks function, which is just being returned by the useState. All right. Set task is going to be utilized to manipulate the values inside of tasks. Now let's move down. We have an H1 element, which is being rendered. And then we have an unordered list. Inside of this unordered list, we are inserting some JavaScript code. That's what this curly bracket means. And what we're doing is we're iterating through that array of objects by utilizing the map function. We are going to reference each one of those objects by the variable list object. And inside of the map function, we're saying for each one of these list objects, I want you to render the following. And what I'm rendering is the list item function. Well, for each object, it goes into the list item function and it returns a list item that says I am a list and an input field that will have a completed mark that I can either click for ensuring that it is completed or it is not completed. So let's go back to V. We re-render it. We can see it, the H1. Here is the iteration over the list of objects. For each one of those set objects, we're getting a list item that says I am a list item and an independent useState for a checkbox, allowing us to click or unclick an item to mark it as completed. Did that answer your question, Owen?
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. James?
In the app JSX file, does the mapping have to happen before calling on the list item JSX, or because I'm noticing like list object variable like from the map like isn't really being utilized anymore?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if we bring it to the outside, right? Let's say that I don't call it in here and I don't return anything. Right, so I'm not returning anything, and let me actually just comment all of this out as well. All right, easy peasy. All right, so all of that's being commented, and I just call list item. Well, it's still going to render a list item, right? And it's going to give me my checkbox. But I do want to pass all of those attributes of the list object. And notice how it's only showing one time. Well, I want this list item to be represented for all 7 of those objects, right? So that's going to take us into the next portion of our lecture of passing down these attributes to be able to access them. Does that answer your question, James?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. All right. So now let's go ahead and take a look at this couple of errors that we're getting here. Let me refresh our page, send a refresh, and tell me, hey, each child of a list should have a unique key prop. Now this is happening because we're utilizing the map function. Every time you iterate through something and you're creating props like this, it's going to ask you to create a key. So you can just add a key, list object.id, which we know is available, right? We have the list object and we know that it has IDs inside of them that are unique. So that's typically what I do to make sure that they have a common ID or that they don't have a common ID. Now, let's go into actually generating some of the content that we want to represent inside of the list item. I need a way to pass down props. That's what they're called. They're called props, right? I need a way to pass down all of the information of the list item. So I could either pass the whole list item itself, right? I could say, hey, item is equal to list object and pass it down to my list item. So when I do it this way, all I need to do is go inside of list item and say, hey, I want to grab item from my props. And now instead of I am a list, I can say, hey, inside here, I want you to render item.task. And now we can see we're getting the tasks for each one of those tasks, right? If we go inside of task.json, for the key of task, we have write down for the to-do list, and here it is, write documentation for to-do lab, right? So there's all of the information being rendered. I'm simply just iterating through, passing down the item, grabbing it from list item, and then rendering it here in line 7. All right, so I'm feeding the child. Let me go ahead and go into our TL draw. Here we have our app. Inside of my app, I have a list of objects. So here is my tasks, which is equal to a list of objects. I'm sure at this point we get that idea, right? And then we map through that UL. So here's my UL. Let's do UL. And then we have tasks.map. And inside of this task.map, I am calling the list object, iterating through it. And when I iterate through it, got to make this a little bigger. I'm actually creating an object. Or I'm creating that list item. Now this list item needs to know, hey, what is the title? Well, all I'm doing is I'm grabbing the list object that's here, and I'm force feeding it straight into the li item so that it can show me my list object dot tasks. All right, so I'm passing down the information straight into that component. So with that said, what should be the initial value for is completed? Should it always be false? Or what should it be set to?
To the value that's in your JSON file. So it should be list object dot. I can't remember what's. Let me look at
Yeah,
completed.
I believe it's completed. All right, so let's go.
I just looked at it.
Perfect. Yeah, so now we have item dot is completed, and if we go into Vite, we can see that it automatically shows me the ones that are completed already. All right, let's hear it, Juan.
Just curious for the item, when you're in app.jsx, does it have to be item or can you name that whatever you want it to be?
That's a great question. Yeah, so here in app.jsx, I named it item, and because I named it item, within list item.jsx, this has to be named item, right? So it has to be matching what we set as the attribute. I could name it task, and that would also work, but I need to ensure that it's matching, because now it's throwing me an error saying, hey, there's no prop. But I could change it back to tasks. And I could just go in here. And now it would function properly. All right, so whatever it is that you name it on that left-hand side of the equal sign has to match what is being passed as a parameter here within curly brackets. Does that answer your question, Juan?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Of course. Any other questions?
This is probably a dumb question, but there's no such thing. Why aren't we using use effect on this? Because can you just explain that? Because I feel like that'll give me a better understanding of use effect.
Why are we not utilizing use effect for this?
Yes.
Got it. Okay. So in this case, we're not utilizing use effect because there's not really anything that there's not a behavior that I'm trying to keep track of as of yet, right? Like when I click on these, there's nothing that I necessarily want to change as of now. The only thing that I wanted to do was be able to iterate through the file and have a button that will show me whether something is completed or not. The behavior that I want to create now is to actually update the list of the tasks. And that's going to be where use effect comes in. But as of now, because there is no behavior that it's happening within some sort of state change, I don't need use effect. Right? So use effect is for behaviors that should be triggered by state change.
Okay. That does answer my question.
Awesome. All right, let's take a look at this again, right? So we have our key, we have our list object. We're iterating through that entire list. We're iterating through each one of these lists by utilizing the .map function. We then name it list object as our variable that is referencing these curly brackets inside of this array. We then get a list item that is being rendered. That is happening here. Here's our list item that is being rendered. And inside of said list item, we are passing in this object of tasks. I am force feeding it down to the li component by the variable of task. Inside of list item, I am then grabbing that variable of tasks and then utilizing that object, because right now it's just an object. I'm saying object at the key of task is what I want you to render. So here we see list item, left-hand side, object at the key of tasks. So object, key of tasks. So write down to-do app or write documentation for the to-do app. That's what shows up. And then we have our input field of type checkbox, which is checking if it is completed. So here's our input field of type checkbox that is being set to the initial value of, hey, is the object completed? So object is not completed, which is false, and that's why it is not checked. And we see it as a blank space. Does anyone have any questions over how to pass down props? All right. I don't see any questions on the Yankee questions channel. I'm not getting any questions here. I'm just gonna pass this file over in the Yankee questions in case anyone is trying to follow along. That way we all have the same code. And I'll pass in app.jsx as well. All right. So let's go into actually building some functionality, right? Because just as we mentioned, we don't just want to be able to click these boxes. Maybe after we click these boxes, we want them to disappear. We don't want to see them anymore, right? All right, well, how can we do that? All we need to do is create a function that will essentially filter through these list items and utilize that set task variable to update this information. So because I want to utilize the set tasks every time someone clicks this button, right, I'm going to create a use effect or a function that will be triggered every time someone clicks this button. All right. So with that said, how could I get set tasks to be isolated to one independent click, right? So if we go back to our drawing, currently we have this parent to child relationship. So how could I get set tasks to be in this nested relationship?
Would we
Can
go
you
to
pass
the
it?
Go ahead.
I was just saying, can you pass set tasks, the function?
Yeah, I could pass the entire function as a prop, right? I could pass set tasks as set tasks. And then I could unpack it within my list item. And say set tasks. Great. So now I pass it down. It's within the child, and now I can utilize it. Fantastic. So now every time I click this function or I click this button, I want my list to get rid of any of the list items that have already been completed. So let's do that. Let's do a little bit of pseudocode. So on check, if check is true, update list of tasks to only show tasks that are not completed. All right. How do I do that?
You can use the filter function.
Awesome. So I could use the filter function. So let's start building this function. Let's say const handle checked. And this function is going to update the list, right? So because we know it's updating the list, we're going to say we want to set tasks to something. So for now, I'm just going to say something dot filter, where each item is being evaluated. And we only want it if item dot completed or actually we want to where item dot ID. Now I'm getting myself confused. All right, we're going to filter it out and we want to do it so that we can update this task. All right, so fantastic. We have the task, the item ID. Every time I click it to mark it as completed, we're going to go ahead and remove it, meaning that I want to filter where the ID is not equal to my current task.id. All right. Now this something portion, what would that something be? Our filter is a array function, as far as I know, it belongs to an array. So what array are we referencing to here?
would it be your JSON?
Yeah, so it would be the tasks, right, that we imported earlier. So maybe this is living in the wrong file. Let's take that back out. Let's go back to app.jsx and create it here. So handle check, we want to set tasks, and we want to set that where task.filter item, where item ID is not equal to task ID. And let's have this function take in task, just that it works properly. Okay, so now we have our function. And theoretically, we know that our function may work correctly, right? Well, when we talked about isolating this code, before we were passing down set tasks, but maybe what we want to do is we actually want to pass in handle check. We go to list item, change this for handle check. And we didn't make sure that if check was true. So let me add that real quick because we have to make sure that if check is true. Oh, actually we could do that in here. All right. So now we have our handle check and we want something to happen on check. How do I trigger this handle check component in here? All right, because we want it to happen every time the event is triggered. What goes into this portion now? Well, what goes into this portion is we pass in the handle check function and the task itself. So now let's refresh it. Here's our tasks. Okay, that's not working properly because we can see that it's working regardless of whether an item is being marked as completed or uncompleted. All right, so these should not disappear. So let's fix that. Let's say if event.target.checked, then handle click. Else, oh, I missed that one. Else, we want to set is completed to e.target.checked. All right, so there's a little bit of a ternary statement. We could break this out into a separate function if we wanted to do an if and else. But now you'll see that when I unclick already completed task, they still stay. But when I click task to be completed, they are removed from my list of objects all the way until I have an empty list. Now, this isn't changing anything in task.json. The only thing that's changing is this tasks. And I can check that by utilizing useEffect. So I can utilize useEffect to console.log tasks every time that the variable of tasks changes. So let's take a look at what we have. Okay, you're not closing. There we go. All right, so here's all of my tasks. We can see an array of objects. Great, there's 7 of them. If I mark one of them to be true, now it's showing me, hey, the state was changed. You told me to keep an eye on this state. Because its state changed, I'm going to trigger the function. And the function says to console log the current array. So it logs it for me. Well, if I do one that hasn't, then from marking one as incompleted, the state didn't change. All right, I never triggered a set state function. But when I mark one that is completed and it changes the state, it triggers that console log statement again. So there's the whole tie of useEffect, useState, props, and components. That was a lot of information today. With that said, I want to make sure there's ample time for questions. So let's open up the floor for questions now. Go ahead, James.
Yeah, so it seems that the use effect seems to be for developers to just check their work. Am I on the right track with that? Or is it useful for other reasons?
Use effect is mainly going to be useful for API calls. Once we start working with our CRUD applications and more of the full stack involvement, that's when we're going to see more of use effect coming into play. But for front end development specifically, I think use effect does help a lot for developer usage as far as seeing the current value. Yes, that's correct. Does that answer your question, James? Okay,
Yes, thank you.
of course. Any other questions? Mind blown? We just need time away from the keyboard. Is that what's going on here? All right, that makes sense.
I'm fried. And not in that way. I'm fried. Yeah.
All right, makes sense. Let me go ahead and stop the recording.